On the 21st of November, 1990, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was released in Japan. It was a smash success. Nintendo's initial stock of 300,000 consoles sold out the first day. The following years, on the 23rd of August 1991 and the 11th of April 1992, in America and Europe was met with swift success. Nintendo entered the 16-bit era of gaming, ready to take Sega's Mega Drive head-on, and thus began the final days of the Nintendo Entertainment System. The NES was a juggernaut, not in its hardware maybe, but in design and marketability. Its promises were simple and direct, from its VCR styling to the 8-bit graphics on screen. Everyone knew what it was and how it played. It's why 38 million consoles entered homes around the world by 1991. The Super NES, on the other hand, was a technical powerhouse. F-Zero and Pilotwing showed off the new Mode 7 sprite scaling for 3D-like effects. But these advanced graphics came at a steep price tag of $200 USD. That's around $470 today. Not cheap. Even before the Super NES launched, people were questioning if it was worth it. Though inflation moved slower back then, it was still a steep price tag. Nintendo heard the cries and realized not everyone could afford such a high fee, yet they wanted to get in on gaming. The NES had already been marked down to $99 by the time the Super NES rolled onto store shelves. Price wasn't the only complaint, but convenience. Many lamented that the Super NES could not play the original console's 8-bit library. They would sit on the shelf useless, unless the effort was made to rehook the old console back up. This was all confirmed as heading into 1992, the NES still accounted for about 30% of Nintendo's hardware sales, proving for sure there was still a sizable base remaining. So they got to work on a refresh of that old 8-bit machine. First up was to give it that classic game system look, with the cartridges being loaded in the top. As is well known at this point, the original Western NES model was designed to not look like a traditional game console, due to the American video game crash of '83 that wiped 97% of the gaming market out. Yes, that was purely an American event. Few seem to mention that. However, America is a large market, so Nintendo was playing it safe. They took inspiration from a VCR. This would hide the game cartridge when in use, making it look nothing like the then infamous Atari with a game sticking out the top. But making a front-loading console wasn't so easy. When loading in a cartridge, you're going to need to apply force to get a solid connection between the game's pins and the system's connectors. Trying to apply so much force from the front would inevitably result in the game system sliding backwards. It can't slide in smooth like a VHS tape. So Nintendo's solution to get around this was to design a loose connector that the game could slip into, which then the user would push down on to tighten the connection. Although not the most elegant solution, it successfully hid the game and functioned. For a while at least. It was not uncommon in time for the connectors to start to bend, and this of course results in a loose cartridge, and thus no game on screen. It had a higher chance of happening from dirty carts with dust and grime working its way inside. This defect would not rear its head for most people until much later, but it was common enough for repair ads to mention game blinking errors or the red light flashing on the front of the system. But now, after Nintendo helped bring the market's faith back into gaming, there was no stigma. The same man who handled the original console's composition could take on this reworking. Designer Lance Barr at Nintendo of America. He knew it was simple. Load the game from the top like basically every other system. Next, it was about cutting costs. First out was the expansion port that was never used on the NES by any peripheral, even in Japan or third parties. The disk system for the Famicom didn't even use it. Second, the removal of the lockout chip, meaning unlicensed and PAL games now booted without adapters. This late in its life, Nintendo figured it didn't matter. Any sale was a bonus. The third cut is much more controversial, particularly in more modern times. The elimination of composite video output and using only RF. Although composite was coming to be the new standard, every TV had RF, so it was the safe bet. It's likely Nintendo's internal research showed that the majority of customers used RF, particularly those who are more likely to buy what's now a last-gen system. Yet the biggest change of all would be the very look of the NES itself. Out was the VCR look, and in was something decidedly more fun. A bit more sleek, but not in a modernist way. It's got some angles with the controller port hub sticking up, visually separating it from the power and reset switches that join the cartridge slot and being rounded. For good measure, the controller would also be redesigned to suggest the Super NES's controller. This design was reused in Japan as well for the new Famicom, just without the bump on top. There, it would also retain composite out. Lance Barr himself shared his perspective in an interview with Nintendojo.
We considered a reduction in scale, but the point of the redesign was reduction in manufacturing costs, so everything was evaluated. The redesigned NES did not use the zero-force connector, but instead relied on a direct insert connector. Form following function, the new connector placed the game 90 degrees to the main PCB, and eliminated much of the bulk needed for the old electronics and connector. The redesign was made several years after the original, which was designed in 1984. The boxy look was out, and I thought it was time for a more sleek and inviting look.
Although the original model became iconic in time, because, to be frank, there is nothing else that looks like it. The deliberate choice to have it blend in with your parents' entertainment center made it truly one of a kind. The NES top loader, also known by its codename 101, in contrast was a cheerfully colored shrunken thing that ditched the disguise for a straightforward, toy-like top-loading slot that will always work, proudly displaying the game like a monolith, much more like the original Famicom. And for those reasons, it's the one this rabbit prefers. Not that it's perfect. RF being the output could result in a weaker picture, with blurred pixel edges and dark vertical lines across the screen. That's known as jail bars. A large reason for this is likely due to the lack of metal shielding inside, which was changed out to a cheaper plastic type. It has been rumored that a small number of late-produced top loaders have composite out, also called AV out. And it's still debated today if that was the case, or it was people sending them in for repairs due to bad video quality, where Nintendo would swap in a different motherboard. This new board would be the same one as the Japanese new Famicom model had, which, as I said earlier, retained the composite out. Either way, I'll be honest, I never noticed a lesser video quality as a kid on my old small CRT. Maybe if I had a Trinitron or some fancy model, I'd have noticed. But would I have cared for long? Probably not. Not like I had another NES to compare it to. This console revision would debut 1993 in North America and Japan, followed by Australia in '94. It would retail for a sharp price of $50 USD and 70 Aussie dollars. In Australia, it was often packaged with Mario Brothers, World Track Meet, and Tetris for another 10. In America, it didn't have any official pack-ins, although it wasn't uncommon for retailers to do their own. At $50, $160 in 2025, it was only a quarter of the price of the Super NES, and there was plenty of cheap games for the pickings at the bargain bin. And there was lots of new titles still rolling onto shelves. The Pink Puffball himself would enter stage right in Kirby's Adventure, the first title where he could copy enemy powers. The sequel to a hit arcade game would arrive as an NES exclusive with Bubble Bobble 2, and Mega Man would have his final 8-bit adventure with his sixth title, with Nintendo themselves choosing to publish this one in America after Capcom passed on it. America would get an exclusive published by Nintendo, Star Tropics 2: Zoda's Revenge, a super unique RPG adventure where you travel across time to many different locales and meet historical figures like Leonardo da Vinci and not-so-historical ones such as Sherlock Holmes. It was not a big seller, probably due to the box art displaying Zoda's Revenge with Star Tropics 2 as a footnote. The remodel system would not come to Europe. Still, they would get some exclusives with Smurfs and Asterix. It always feels great to mention Asterix. Some cross-gen titles would hit, like the infamous Mario is Missing, where players would get a preview of some Super NES sprites on the NES, and maybe learn a bit of geography. What is it with educational games and using sprites from future systems? There was also a flurry of Game Boy dual releases, such as DuckTales 2, Jurassic Park, and Tetris 2. Eventually, the final titles would roll in. In Japan, the Famicom's last outing would release on the 24th of June 1994, with Adventure Island 4, a game that would not make its way west like the others. This one turned the series into more of a non-linear Metroidvania platformer. A special note about this one is it got an English fan patch only 4 years later in '98. America would get its final title in December '94 with Wario's Woods, a cross-generational puzzle game where players take the role of Toad who must save the forest creatures' homes from Wario and his monsters. It's a match 3 game with a twist. The pieces are made up of color-coded monsters and bombs. Toad picks them up a la Mario 2, and must connect 2 monsters with a matching colored bomb to make 3 of a kind and clear them. There is lots of options for movement, such as picking a single piece, a whole stack, or kicking objects across the screen. You can even climb up entire stacks. It has all the features of the Super NES version except versing a computer. You can still take on another human. It even has exclusive bosses that the other version doesn't. The last game to hit Europe and the console as a whole in May 1995 would be a port of the Lion King game from Virgin Interactive. It appears to be somewhat based on the Game Boy edition, with the camera far zoomed out and missing half the game. All the stages where you play as adult Simba are gone. The Game Boy version was already cut down from its console counterparts, and this one even more so. Not even the final boss fight is here. A bit of a sad note to go out on. What's remarkable is, this is essentially 1 year before the N64 would launch in June '96 in Japan. Nintendo was clearly using this as a third revenue stream. I'm sure we're all familiar with how up until the Switch's release, the company would also have a handheld to keep them afloat if their main console was having underwhelming sales. In this case, they had the Super NES, the Game Boy, and the NES. It wasn't just a double dip, it was a triple dip.
Double dipped? What are you talking about?
Production of the NES console would completely stop in '95 in America and Europe. But elsewhere in the world, things were just starting to heat up. Let's set the scene by taking a quick step back. Nintendo had not conquered everywhere in the world yet. There was borders they, nor anyone else, dared to cross. The 2 most relevant being China and Russia. China, although starting to open up to foreign media since their economic reform in the late 1970s, there were still huge barriers in place. 2 big ones being steep tariffs and government regulations on video game consoles, since they viewed them as a negative influence on children. Russia and the other Eastern European countries were just coming out of the Cold War that ended in late '92. They were near completely isolated from much of the world. Many businesses were hesitant to begin talks to enter as they had no clue what to expect or how to approach the market, viewing it as very risky. Finally, the most major factor China and Russia shared is they had near zero IP laws, making it impossible to enforce copyright or prevent clones and bootlegs from flooding the market. The market, of course, got flooded anyhow, and that is exactly what we're here to discuss. The exact origins of these Famicom clone consoles, or Famiclones for short, like most things technically illegal, is obscured. However, the origins generally can be traced to Taiwan, where the Famicom's hardware was first reverse engineered. It was around 1987, the year Nintendo released the console in the country. It appears a few companies had cracked the code all at once. 3 in particular had banded together called Taizing, Bitcorp, and a person named Huang Shisha. They filed a patent. In the same year, another company called Syntec filed a lawsuit against a handful of unknown people for leaking their own clone of the hardware. Nintendo would have the patent revoked, but it was obviously far too late. Right away that year, multiple consoles hit the Taiwanese market and were only a little cheaper than an actual Famicom. After all, since the technology was brand new, all they could really save were the shipping costs. But who would be interested in these Famiclones? Countries Nintendo hadn't entered. They quickly spread across Asia, Eastern Europe, and even far beyond, going by many names. The Taiwanese Famiclone, called the Micro Genius, is probably the most common line throughout the world. South Korea, where Japanese cultural products were banned, had the Frog computer. South Africa had Reggie's entertainment system. No, not that Reggie. Venezuela, in a Chad move, just slapped the Nintendo logo on the Famiclone and translated everything into Spanish. China's situation was more complex. They had to sneak them in as educational devices. So they would style them after things like keyboards and contain a hidden cartridge slot, such as the Subor here. But Russia, they had the Dendy. It cannot be understated the importance of this Famiclone. What the NES is to us Westerners, what the Famicom is to Japan, the Dendy is to Eastern Europeans. It was put out by a company called ScHlAuChi. The first edition of the console was a rebranded Micro Genius, launched in December 1992. The following summer of '93, the Dendy Jr. came out styled much more closely to a Famicom, at an even cheaper price, reportedly around $30 USD. Naturally, this is the iconic model. Just as the NES was finishing its run in the West, it was being reborn elsewhere. So they had consoles. But what about games? If they couldn't import the systems, they couldn't import as games, right? That is correct. So they had to make them. They did play the popular games like Mario Brothers, Contra, and Ninja Gaiden on those 999-in-1 multi-carts YouTubers love to buy and laugh at. But there was many originals, such as Magic Carpet 1001, a shoot-'em-up based on the Arabian Nights legends, Dragon Ball Z 5, a beat-'em-up that covers the story through the Cell Saga, even featuring multiple characters, Goku, Piccolo, and Krillin, with Vegeta being a bonus unlockable, Chuhan Zengba, a war between Chu and Han, a massive strategy game. Even as time wore on and there stopped being any official games produced, developers would backport 16-bit titles to the console. Here's Earthworm Jim 2 on the Famicom. How about Mortal Kombat 2? Even unofficial sequels would appear, like Super Contra 7 that controlled exactly like the NES original. When others gave up, these developers got to work supporting the consoles for those who couldn't access the newer technology. Yes, there are some stages or characters missing at times, but that's the nature of backporting and being on a tight budget. The Lion King was an official release and ended up making more compromises. Many of these are essentially ROM hacks before the concept was given a proper name. Nintendo was finished with the console, and it was time for others to carry the legacy on. These games were sold right alongside other products in stores across the countries. They were even marketed on TV spots like Dendy, the New Reality, that would review new releases. For people in these parts of the world, it's just what gaming was. You'd see Somari right next to another cart called Donkey Kong Country 4. Eventually things would become a bit more official. Nintendo in spring 1994 found out how popular these Dendy consoles were in Russia, and they struck a deal. ScHlAuChi would be the exclusive distributor of Super NES and Game Boy systems in the region. In addition, Nintendo would not take any legal action over the Dendy systems. These would not last long, as sales began to slow down in the mid-90s. ScHlAuChi had plans to expand into other electronics like DVD players, but passed on this when a deal was struck with the government to help modernize their processes with computers. Supposedly other agencies weren't happy about this, and it even led to assassination attempts, with the founder of ScHlAuChi, Maxim Selivanov, who I cannot find a picture of, escaping to another country for months. He was able to return to Russia after some time. The company lost state contracts after that and went bankrupt in '96. The Dendy wing would linger on for a few years, but would be forced to close during the 1998 financial crisis, ending the Dendy legacy.
クリスマス商戦の主役をテレビゲームが占めるようになったのは今から20年前のことです。世界のゲーム産業の基盤を築いた任天堂ファミリーコンピューター、いわゆるファミコンが生誕20年を迎えた今年、惜しまれながらもその役割を終えました。
On the 30th of May, 2003, Nintendo would announce the Famicom is winding down production for the final time. Not just the Famicom, though, also its successor, the Super Famicom. The final console would roll off the assembly line that September. The Nintendo Entertainment System lived to see not only the Super Nintendo rise, but also the N64 and GameCube. It was produced throughout 4 generations of consoles, even outliving Sega themselves. It first debuted in 1983. That is 20 years it was stocked on shelves in some form. People often point to the PS2 as a system that was in production for an absurd amount of time, yet that was only 12. The Atari 2600 lasted 14 years. The NES beats them both. Yet that still isn't the end of the story. After all, there was still Famiclones being produced elsewhere, and a whole new wave coming in of nostalgic gamers. Only a couple years later, in 2005, a certain project caught the eyes of the internet. Something by a company called Shenzhen Nanjing Technology, a remake, or rather a demake if you will, of a game called Final Fantasy VII. An RPG that was a hit on the PlayStation 1 was now fully realized in 8 bits on the NES. The characters, environment, and story are all here. Much of the graphics are ripped from other titles and modified. Anything optional was cut, so no Yuffie or Vincent, and side quests are gone. Still, the entire main story is intact with no details left out. That's around 20 hours of gameplay, on par with the other Final Fantasy games found on the NES. What was making these larger scale projects possible? Emulators. In fact, the NES was one of the first consoles to be emulated. It begins over in Japan on the FM Towns computer. This emulator would be featured on a disc called Freeware Collection 3, and it was made by Haruisa Udagawa, who worked at various companies such as Namco and Sonic Team. The emulator would not play many games. It had very limited sound and color emulation. Depending on the game, you very well might need to turn off your speakers. It was a small and important taste of the future. The first major emulator to be released was made by Russian programmer Alex Karavetsky, called Landy NES for DOS and Windows. The source code was shortly picked up by Marat Feyzulin, who also created an MSX emulator, and released this as iNES in the mid-90s, which, believe it or not, cost money at first. This was quickly followed by free options like Nesticle. Yes, the icon is in fact a pair of testicles. That even included built-in debugging features that allowed everyone to reverse engineer and examine exactly how these games work. Mario's physics, Zelda's AI, Castlevania tracking player stats, nothing was off limits. Everything could and would be analyzed and broken down. Nesticle even included a way to edit the graphics right in the emulator. Make it night on Adventure Island, and the Ninja Turtles skin pink. Then share it all on forums with others. Hell, it even spawned translations of games. Among the best work ever is a hack of Mario Bros. 3 called Mario Adventure, a complete overhaul of the original game that adds new weather effects and even modified the engine for new powers. No longer were expensive tools like EEPROM burners required to produce games for the console. Anyone could do it on even an average PC. These tools gave everyone the power. The homebrew scene as we know it today was born. Generally considered the first homebrew cart ever produced is known as Garage Cart. Memblers, aka Joey Parcell, who also is involved in the NESdev.com forums, now .org it seems, depending on your definition of homebrew at least. There was many made in Asia prior to this, but those were from factories. In 2005, these were handmade by Memblers himself, using old Mario Duck Hunt combo cards. About 25 were crafted and sold for a limited time to forum members. It features 3 games, 2 of which were made for the card itself. Hot Seat Harry, a button-mashing title where you mash to send the dot in the middle to your opponent. Munchie Attack, an endless scroller where you control a mouth to eat food and avoid stuff that isn't food to earn a high score. The third title, Solar Wars, comes from another developer called Chris Koval, a 2-player game where you lob missiles from a tank at each other off-screen. All 3 are available online to play today. And more kept coming. Battle Kid Fortress Apparel, Kira Kira Star Knight, Wonderland Dizzy, The Legends of Aulia, Cheryl the Writer, Little Medusa, Nebs and Debs, Super Homebrew War featuring characters from a bunch of other homebrew games, Nescape, Eskimo Bob, Butte, Jay and Silent Bob Mall Brawl, Micro Mages, Multi-Dude, Trial of Carzoid, Slow Mole, Witch and Wiz, Dataman, Flap Happy, Skate Cat. Look, there's a lot, and they aren't slowing down. Over the years, newly produced development boards have become available to buy online. New programming languages like NESFAB by Puppy Games have been released to make things easier for developers. There is even options to make NES games, potentially, without programming today. With tools like NES Maker from 8-Bit Heroes, people continue to flock to the console, expand its capabilities and gaming library. Online play is even possible in titles like Super Tilt Pro, thanks to Wi-Fi chips, online on your NES. Calling it a rebirth would be a lie, since the NES never died. It evolved and mutated, it got augmented, but never has it sailed down the Sanzu River towards the next life. Games and consoles haven't stopped being made, and often make the best-selling lists on sites like Alibaba and Taobao. FPGA technology is now allowing people to even emulate the hardware itself, whether it's homebrew options like the Mister or premium Famiclones such as the Analog NT. What was supposed to be the final act for the system turned out to be the next chapter, and the story of the Nintendo Entertainment System is still being written by the developers of today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, it really helps. And thank you so much to my Patreons, you dudes are awesome. This video was really cool to work on. There was so much more to the last days of the NES than I ever expected, and an update for those of you who care. There will be a change of format coming up on this channel. For my larger videos, those that are like 40 minutes plus, I'll be cutting them up into episodes and releasing them bi-weekly. Like with Pokemon Yellow I'm currently working on, it will go something like episode 1 is Viridian Forest and Brock, 2 is Mount Moon, 3 is Cerulean City, etc. Hopefully this will allow me to have a more regular upload schedule, so it will be a bit before the next video hits the channel. But from then on it should even out to being fairly regular. I'll see you all then. Take care.